I request Mr. Navtej Sarna and Mr. Vikas Swarup to kindly join us on stage, please.
And she sent me an orange hot and I sent me a yellow hot back. I mean yellow and orange.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and members of the press. On behalf of Aleph Book Company, I extend a very warm welcome to each one of you to the launch and the book discussion on Crimson Spring by Mr. Navtej Sarna. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our special guest for the evening, Mr. Vikas Swarup. Mr. Swarup is a novelist and former diplomat. He joined the Indian Foreign Services in 1986, and like Ambassador Sarna, he was India's Foreign Office spokesperson from 2015 to 2017, after which he was posted to Canada as High Commissioner of India. He retired from the Foreign Services in June last year. He is currently hosting a weekly program on foreign affairs called Diplomatic Dispatch for India's parliamentary channel, Sansad TV. Mr. Swarup is also the author of the 3 best-selling novels, Q&A, adapted as the multiple Oscar-winning Slumdog Millionaire, 6 Suspects, adapted as the 9-part web series, The Great Indian Murder on Disney Hotstar, and The Accidental Apprentice. His books have been translated into 47 international languages. Mr. Swarup will be in conversation with Mr. Sarna this evening. Thrilled to have you amongst us. And of course, the manner of the evening, Mr. Navtej Sarna. A huge round of applause, please. I would now like to invite Mr. David Davidar, Managing Director, Aleph Book Company, for the publisher's address.
Navtej, Vikas, yes. I must apologize for keeping you waiting. It was just one of those glitches, but we're all here and we're ready to go, so that's good. I'm going to be very brief because the main event is really the conversation between these 2 distinguished writers, and this is just appetizer. Navtej's masterpiece has been 10 years in the making. It's been well worth the wait because great literary novels are hard to come by, and if early reviews are any indication, this book will come to be seen as one of the finest novels of our time. Besides its obvious literary merits, there were 2 things I was hugely impressed by, but these are very, very difficult to do, even by the most accomplished writers. The first of these is that it's an enormous accomplishment to be able to say something new, arresting, and viscerally impactful about one of the most famous events in modern Indian history. The massacre at Jallianwala Bagh is something most every Indian knows about. What we know about the tragedy might be slightly off the mark, given the rather fanciful popular recreations of the event in films, drama, and books. But what is clear is that this is not new territory. So how can the creative writer say something fresh and original about such well-thought material? You'll have to read Crimson Spring to get a complete answer to that question. But what I would like to say here is that Navtej's novel manages to bring the atrocity to vivid and gut-wrenching life in wholly novel and unexpected ways. The second thing that's really impressive about the novel is the vast amount of research and fact that have gone into its making, despite which the narrative is as clear and fathomable as a Himalayan brook, which is where Navtej is home, so perhaps you got your inspiration from that. This is a book that is literary and original, yet is beautiful and lucid, and completely and utterly readable. It could have so easily become dense, chaotic, and weighted down by the research that has gone into it. But it has avoided that trap, testament to Navtej's skill as a storyteller and creative writer. It gave all of us at Aleph a great deal of fulfillment to work on this novel. I'd like to thank all my colleagues for the work they put into it. I generally hope all of you here will read it, love it as much as we did, and broadcast its virtues far and wide. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. This is not part of the script, but I think this is the best chance that I'm going to get to thank everybody here. First of all of you for having come on what promised to be a rainier day, but fortunately cleared up. Thank you so much for coming in such impressive numbers. It's very, very touching. I really want to thank David in particular for the amount of work that he did with me on the book and helped me to at a very critical stage in the manuscript to fashion it into what it has turned out, and it's out there now for being judged by all of you. And David's immensely efficient team with Enla, with Vasundhara, with Veda, who have and Gitu and others who have been working tirelessly now for months as if this is the only book. I treat it as the only book that Aleph has, and I'm always wondering that they have other books also, but that's okay. Thank you so much, and I want to thank Vikas for making time for this conversation and deciding he's not going to be on television tonight. But thank you, Vikas, for this, and I look forward to the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Before we move into the discussion, I request Mr. Vikas Swarup to release the book and request Mr. Sarna and Mr. Devidar to join me.
Excuse me. Thank you.
Over to you, Mr. Swarup.
Thank you, Vasundhara. Great to see a full house in a post-pandemic environment. So it looks like WhatsApp can do something useful for a change. But really, thank you all for coming. We are here to discuss a remarkable novel, Crimson Spring. Now, if you read the dust jacket, it will say this is about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. But it's really much more than that. It is really about the interplay of history and memory and how the two have shaped the modern Punjabi identity. But let us begin with the Jallianwala Bagh, because your book begins with it. So tell us, what was it about this event, and of course it was a very seminal event, that led you to write an entire novel about it?
Thank you, Vikas. And you know, as I've said somewhere, you always have, as a writer, and nobody knows it better than you always have some ideas in your head that someday I want to write about this. And one of the things that I had in mind here was really that, I wanted to write something on Jallianwala Bagh, and then the centenary was coming up. And it seemed like a good idea to write something about Jallianwala Bagh. And, but when I started reading about it, I saw that there were so many aspects around that event which could either be covered by a huge work of non-fiction, and somehow I have an aversion to footnotes and endnotes and bibliography, and I can't make myself write that sort of a book. And then I realized that Jallianwala Bagh was not just an event in itself. I mean, 100 years on, it looks like a discrete tragedy, a massacre, one of the worst massacres of the 20th century, which ranks with, Katyn or Babiyar or Wounded Knee. But there were several other things happening around that. And then I thought that the best way to attack the subject, if I may say so, is somehow to make it a work of fiction, which takes Jallianwala Bagh as the center, but then explores the various streams that were coming into it and moving out of it. And that's how it ultimately took the shape of the novel that you have in your hand today.
So you said that what motivated you to write this was that the fact that the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was coming up. But then you were 3 years too late. So I want to know, when did you actually start writing this novel and how long did it take?
Well, actually today I was going through parts of it in preparation for this interrogation, and I realized that some of the passages I had written in 2012. I have them in my diary of 2012, which means 10 years ago. I didn't know where those passages would end up and in what form and where. But then I've actually been reading about not Jallianwala Bagh, but alone, but everything else around that was happening in Punjab, the Ghadar movement, the revolutionaries, the freedom movement as a broad backdrop, the Gurdwara reform movement, which was coming out of that for about at least 7-8 years, and it's actually been in the writing process for about 6 to 7 years. So that's how it is.
Now, David Davidar also mentioned this. Given the copious amount of research that this book entailed, you could easily have written a historical. You could have written a historical account of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, probably without the footnotes that you have an aversion to. But I think you enjoy the historical fiction genre, because in your book, The Exile also, it's a fictionalized biography of Maharaja Dalip Singh. So tell us, how difficult it is to write about the interior life of your characters when you have to hew so close to actual facts and events as they happen in history.
It's a very exciting area, and there are people who take a historical character and do anything they want with it, saying that I'm a novelist and I take such and such king or queen and I give it an entirely new direction than what is known, because this is a novel. Now I'm a little old-fashioned with this. I feel that when you're dealing with actual historical characters, then you can push the facts, but only that much that you don't distort them. And you have to, because some people may only read that book on Jallianwala Bagh and think this is history. So you can't be unfair to history in that sense. So historical characters, they are creatures of fiction. But there are historical characters like Udham Singh or Dyer or Odwar, and those, you can give them an interior life, you can give them a psychological, emotional, ambivalence and dimension, but you have to stay within the broad rails of what actually they were. You can't take a person and totally change him if he's a historically well-known person. So it's an exciting place, but having said that, I must say that history is a very, it's a kind of cut and dried subject, largely, because it deals with facts. And then when you deal with facts and you deal with human beings, you find the gaps. You find the gaps, because every human being has so much more than what is actually written down in facts 100 or 150 years ago. What his thoughts were, what his fears were, what his dark thoughts were. So, a novel or a fiction allows you all those spaces to move around in and explore.
Now, your novel opens with a prologue in which you say, "For every event in history is at heart made up of the acts of human beings, and its telling is inevitably colored with the differing shades of pride, regret, ambition, love, pain, courage, and longing that human beings carry within themselves." And the rest of the novel is really the telling of the story through the eyes of 9 characters of the early decades of the 20th century in Punjab. How it got transformed through empire and education and agriculture, and of course, the tragedy of Jallianwala Bagh. You depict very beautifully how the lives of these 9 characters were impacted by the events of the 13th of April 1919, and how some of them in turn impacted the world. So let us delve into the world of these 9 characters. Now the first character that we meet is Maya Devi, who longs for a son, for a child, and has come to the Golden Temple to pray for 40 days. Tell us a little bit about this character.
You know, she's out of the 9 protagonists, she's the only woman protagonist. And therefore, you know, she has a lot on her frayed shoulders. In a way, she's inspired by the actual historical figure of a lady called Ratan Devi, who actually was, and I don't want to give away the storyline completely, but she was deeply involved in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre as a victim, and she gave testimony in front of the Congress Inquiry Committee that was set up as a counter to the Hunter Committee, and I took her testimony, which is about a page and a half or something, and then created Maya Devi, who is you know, she brings to the book all the, you know, the aspects of village life. She expands the geography of the book because she is living in a village beyond the Jhelum, and she ends up in Amritsar. So, you know, the book's geography expanded through her. She brings a woman's point of view and what she saw, what happened, what she experienced. And as you know, it's surprising. Some movies depict it differently, but if you actually go through the list of victims of Jallianwala Bagh, you hardly find any women. There were 2 or 3 women in the casualty list of 379, and those who gave testimony, maybe 7 or 8, out of which only 3 or 4 were actually there. Because women those days were not going out into political gatherings. And they were sitting at home, and it being a Sunday and Vaisakhi, etc., they were certainly not there. But women were victims, because if their husbands died or their children died, I mean, they were victims. So she brings to that aspect. Plus, she brings you know, her identity brings, because as you said, this is a larger Punjab book. The fact that she belongs to a Sikh family, she's married to a Sikh, but she's come to the Golden Temple to ask for a child, but before that she's gone to various pilgrimages, to the Peer, to the Sakhi, to the Gugga Peer, to various places, and that was how the religious identities of those days were. They were extremely flexible rather than completely clear. So she brings a lot of that into the book.
Okay, next we meet 3 members of a family from a village called Tibba. Now, where is Tibba? I couldn't find it on the map, and even Google gave up on it.
You won't find it on any map, because Tibba is pure creation. And Tibba just came to my head, that Tibba is going to be the name of the village, which somehow keeps recurring in the book, and as you rightly said, 3 of the characters, and by, you know, and some others who not directly, but somehow get related to this little village of Tibba. And all I did was locate this village. If you want, I can...
Yeah, please, you want me to give us a flavor of this fictional village.
Read a couple of things on Tibba, a couple of paragraphs on Tibba, because, again, in a novel of this kind, it's very important to locate it somewhere. So you know the weather, you know the climate, you know the rivers, you know, etc. So it says, Tibba was a small, oh, that's better, yeah. Tibba was a small, windy village, bare except for 2 peepal trees, a clump of berry bushes near the well, and far away a straight line of kikar. It was so named because it stood on a small plateau that jutted out without warning from the surrounding landscape about halfway between the Tehsil headquarters at Tarantaran and Harike, the town where the river Byas met the Satluj. If you glanced towards it from the road that ran between these two towns, it would hold your eye because the soil that ran down the ragged slopes of the plateau was of a peculiar hue, different from the loamy red soil of the surrounding plain. In the late afternoon, when the sun rays hit it at a sharp angle, it seemed that strips of golden sand had been painted on the earth with a thick, broad brush. Perhaps it was this mirage that attracted a lone, tired traveller, known in village legend as Natha Jat, who came to Tibba 200 years ago, tied up his 6 goats, built a squat mud hut, and got down to cultivating what must surely be fertile soil. Only it didn't turn out to be so. A few couples drifted up to where he was, and soon Tibba became a small village of hard-working men and women who would work harder than others on the soil just so that they never had to admit that they had been wrong. They also believed that God had sent them an important indication affirming their choice. The surrounding area was known as Khara Manja for its khara or brackish wells. But the well they dug in Tibba had sweet water, and that was reward enough for their hard work. The descendants of Natha and his companions prided themselves on their hard work and on their simplicity and unpretentiousness. Even the names of their village, they would say, showed how unassuming they were. It was not named after its founder, like the village of Talwandi Soba Singh, 15 miles away, nor did it boast that its young men had started going abroad, like the villages of Pannu Jats at Naushera, or their rivals, the Sandhus of Sarhali Kalan, a bit further on. They may not have named the village after Natha Jat, but when he died, they did bury a handful of his ashes in a shrine just at the entrance to the village, beyond the well, and let the rest float into the rushing rainwater of the Patti Nala a day's walk away, which swept them away with a sudden swift curve towards the Byas. That shrine with Natha's ashes was the most revered place in Tibba, and on most nights at least one earthen lamp flickered at its base. On special days like Baisakhi or Diwali, there would be a full circle of diyas, or on nights of the full moon, or on the annual festival of Karwa Chauth, when the women fasted for the long life of their husbands. So that was Tibba.
Very evocative indeed. Now, Tibba, as I said, introduces us to 3 members of a family. There is Navtej Singh, who is a superintendent in the irrigation department. His son, Lance Naik Kripal Singh, who has just returned from the First World War of Basra and Flanders fame. And Mehtab's brother-in-law, Rana. What exactly does this family represent?
No, again, since this book was, in a sense, each one of them is representing certain social, historical narratives that were at play. For instance, Kirpal, Lance Naik Kirpal, who gets recruited for the First World War, actually tells his is the story of the Indian contribution to World War I. Again, fortunately, we've had some revival of that memory in the last couple of years and people have started talking about it. But till a few years ago, I know, fighting the fight myself in some circles, that, this was not our war. These guys were mercenaries. And my belief has been that whatever they were, whatever they fought for, whatever flag they fought under, it was Indian blood shed on foreign soil. And we have a chance to commemorate their memory. And so he's, Punjab in particular, out of the 1.3, 1.4 million men that India contributed to the First World War, the bulk came from Punjab. So Kirpal actually represents that entire tradition, the experiences, and in a way, when you see Michael O'Dwyer was actually resorting to conscription in Punjab. Because first year or so, people volunteered and they went for the money and they went for the izzat and they went for going abroad or a job or food, and the posters were talking of suit and boot and fruit and what are you getting here, and they were going for those 11 rupees a month. But then the horrors of war set in, and then they were running away. And Michael O'Dwyer was actually giving quotas to the Zeldars and the Tehsildars, so producing so many young men. Otherwise, they would have penalties on them in various forms. So that's one area. Then you have, Mehtab, whose father is in the irrigation department, and I put him there because the entire thing of the construction of the canals in Punjab, and what it did to the Punjab economy, to the movement of people, so all that, and plus of course Mehtab is another dimension, and that's again he's a devout sort of follower of the Singh Sabha movement, in the sense that he's part of that revival of Sikh identity which was happening in the face of Arya Samaj movement or the Christian missionary movement, and and Rala is he's a typical village guy, and then he sort of
Starts off as a wastrel.
And then takes baptism. So, a lot of things come under Rala's thing, life in a village, and, the entire Sant tradition, which was baptizing people, and also the fact, again, the mixed Hindu-Sikh identity. He's named Rala Ram, but he's because that's what was happening. And then he changes after baptism, but he still can't get a proper, quote-unquote proper Sikh name. He still remains Rala Singh, but that's the way.
Now you write with a lot of empathy and conviction about Kirpal's time in the Great War. And you have explained also what attracted you to that. I want to know what kind of research did this entail, researching the contribution of the Sikh infantry in the First World War?
Well, there's a lot been written about it, but I was actually trying to track down the experience of a soldier who would have been recruited in this area and gone to the areas that I wanted to describe in the book. I wanted to talk about Europe, Flanders and Chapelle, etc., and then fought in Mesopotamia. So to get a Sikh regiment that did all this, I had to search around, and fortunately, I had colleagues, I had people who would advise me. I have two gentlemen who've come down from far, Brigadier, now General Murugan and Neelkant, who were greatly fascinated and helpful in terms of military research, and I found them and they helped me trace, and there were others who we could trace war diaries, and we could trace actual letters, of course, of the soldiers, which have been collected by David Omisi. And all that put together gave you enough material to actually, it gave you too much material, but you had to then trace out certain aspects which describe the normal soldier's life who fought in these theaters. Yeah.
You want to do a little?
Yeah, I have one paragraph which I was trying to read out because there are lots of descriptions of the war, but I'll keep it very short. And this is when he comes back. And when he had been recruited because he knew some Gurmukhi and Angrezi, and so the recruiting sergeant had told him, you'll come back as a Subedar. So now he's back. Now Kirpal was back, not quite a Subedar, but at least a lance naik, a veteran of Flanders and Basra, and he knew it was nothing short of a miracle that he was back. This is what the war was like. He had been protected by the holy book, the final form of the Guru, that the 47th Sikhs had always carried with them. Otherwise it had been the devil's war, a war without end, in which the shells fell like monsoon rain, and men dropped to the ground like jamuns fall from a tree in a storm. Fought first in a land of cold misery, rain and snow, where death came screaming in the form of bullets from snipers hidden by the mist, where bodies lay unburied and unburnt for months, preserved by the snow. In this war, one did not see the enemy face to face. Sword did not clash gallantly with sword. Men did not stand up and do battle. Instead, they burrowed into the ground. Airships sailed the sky like kites, and cannons shot fireballs that weighed 12 months each and destroyed the earth for 500 paces around where they fell. Death leapt up from mines in the ground if you stepped on them, and poison gas choked you to an unholy end. And then there had been the forgotten war in Mesopotamia, where the heat announced itself from afar, like an angry god in the sky, and poured down in molten sheets, and the rain turned the land into a quagmire, which rose to the ankles, and mosquitoes swirled in thick clouds, and it became difficult to walk in the endless desert. If one had to see the anger of the Almighty, this war had been it.
Fantastic. And actually, yes, I could see that, Lance Naik Kripal could never come to terms with French warfare. That was something completely alien.
It was a horrendous experience. They hated the trenches more than they hated the Germans.
Exactly.
Because, they were waterlogged, there were monstrous trench rats, there were mosquitoes, there were all sorts of things. And, you had to stay in a trench. It was terrible. And cold. They were not used to the cold of Europe. They had been picked up and pumped, in September 1914, the unit reaches France and is sent to the front. And it's icy cold Europe in winter. That's why those soldiers didn't really last there into the second winter. They had to be moved.
Now you also write very lovingly about the wrestling tradition in Punjab. And your depiction of the akhada in Dibba is so evocative, I could actually smell the earth of the mud pit. So what attracted you to the world of wrestling?
This was the passage I wrote in 2012 about the wrestling tradition. And, I don't know, and, as a fiction writer, that very often you yourself can't trace where the thing is coming from, And, the only thing I can say is that, when I was creating that village, I thought that, yes, what would the youngsters be doing? Either they get drunk, so there is a theka, and there is a akhada, because that was the kind of exercise that was available, or the recreation that was available. And in this book, the theka and the akhada are next to each other, which is, and the wrestler is very angry because he tells that guy that, he curses him and he says, "May thieves take your woman, but, you have come and put this factory of hell next to my akhada, and there's one day lightning will strike this place because these two things can't go together." But if I have to trace to anything, I think in my childhood, which I spent some years in Dehradun, we used to live in a place called Racecourse, which had a Khali Maidan in the middle, and every Sunday there would be wrestling. And there would be, the dhol would start in the afternoon, and the entire colony and all the kids would turn up, and you'd see the akhada, the pit and the churned earth and the black loamy soil, and you'd see these, oiled up bodies sort of wrestling away. So something from there, I think, that's probably where it was born.
I thought it was Dangal. Anyway, continuing with the characters. Now, one of the most important characters is Sucha, who's a compounder with Dr. Hardeep Singh, but who's actually secretly a revolutionary for the Ghadar movement. What was the significance of the Ghadar movement, and how did it lead directly to Jallianwala Bagh?
Well, may not have been an immediately direct causal sort of impact, but the fact is that Ghadar is one of the most dramatic parts of the freedom movement, again, largely unexplored. And that's, that fascinated me always, so I wanted to see if, and there was a connection in a way that because of the Ghadar revolutionaries coming from Canada, West Coast, etc., back to cause rebellion in the ranks of the Indian units, the Punjab government, particularly Michael O'Dwyer, had really used a strong hand under the Defence of India rules, which they could use during the war, to clamp down and catch anybody whom he suspected of possible terrorist conspiracy or even thinking about terrorism, and send them to Andamans and hung them and various things. And the Defense of India rules allowed no appeal. They allowed no due process. You could pick up just anyone, you could close down newspapers, you could do. Now when the war ended, and the Ghadarites had actually been crushed, more or less, or they had run away into different areas in different countries, Germany, Kabul, etc. Then the British government didn't know how to handle the situation. They could not carry on with the Defense of India rules. So that's when they set up the Sedition Committee, and who, under Justice Rowlatt, who then produced the two Rowlatt Bills, which was nothing else but the Defense of India rules in a different form. So in that way there was a connection, and Michael O'Dwyer saw conspiracy in every corner of Punjab, and he wanted to use the Rowlatt Act. So that Sucha brings in the entire Gadar stream.
Next we meet Gurnam Singh. Now he's a pleader quite favorably inclined towards the British government, but he's very disappointed by the Rowlatt Act because it would put leaders like him out of a job, because the Rowlatt Act did not allow any judicial recourse at all. Who did you base Gurnam Singh on?
Gurnam is a pleader, he's a vakil. There was a character, there was an actual figure called Gurdam Singh Salaria. Now he was a vakil in Amritsar, and he actually gave testimony to the Gandhi Inquiry Committee again. And he was actually trying to prevent the violence on April 10th on the bridges outside the Amritsar Hall Gate, which then led to further violence on the 13th. But that was the first actual clash, and he was riding on a white horse between the soldiers on one hand and the crowd, and saying don't fire, and telling the crowd go back home, because that day the crowd was agitated because the two Satyagraha leaders, Satyapal and Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu, had been deported to Dharamsala, and the crowd was very angry. And this lawyer almost got shot in the process. And then he was picked up and he was jailed, and although he had been trying to help them. So that was his duality, that he was, in some ways, he felt he was, he knew the world of the colonial masters and he could act on their behalf. On the other hand, they themselves turned on him and put him in jail. So he was, there was, I suppose there were an entire classes of people who lived on the fringes of the colonial masters. And there were clerks, and there were lawyers, and there were policemen, and there were, various people working for the administration, but who had would have had this split loyalty, and which became aggravated one way or the other. I don't know if you have the time, otherwise we could do questions, but if you want a reading, I can do one. On Gurnam.
I think this duality that he's, on the one hand, he's sympathetic to the British, on the other hand, he's disgusted by them. I think it would be useful to just get a glimpse into his head.
Yeah, actually, this is a portion when he actually has been thoroughly humiliated by the authorities, but he's been jailed, he's been, really humiliated, and then he is. We meet him again, and this chapter is called The Humiliation of Gurnam Singh Gambhir. Gurnam's fever had faded, only to be replaced by a deep torment and anger. Anger at the helpless misery of his countrymen, at the injustices meted out to them by an unheeding God. He could not understand why a people who prayed day and night, who genuflected towards any possible manifestation of divinity, had to suffer so much. Wasn't it enough that they were writhing under the onslaught of epidemics and famine, that they were burdened by debt and poverty? God had also placed over them an unfeeling, unrelenting arbiter of their daily destiny, a foreign ruler who believed that he was born to rule because of the color of his skin, who believed that one European life was worth 10 Indians, who had no intentions of ever leaving this land that had furnished and financed his palaces and treasures and industries, who dragged out the whole political game gambit by gambit, dangling a distant hope in one hand while taking it away with the other. He cared little that thousands of Indians had spilt their blood in distant battlefields for his glory, fighting an enemy that was not their enemy for no reason except loyalty, a reason of no value in his eyes. Indians were nothing but some low form of life, to be tortured, exploited, deceived, robbed. And then, when the whim took the killer, to be shot in cold blood. Like they had been shot on the railway line 4 days earlier and the previous evening in Jallianwala Bagh. Not in some distant town, secluded valley or desert waste, but right here in his city. His city. The city that ran in his blood. He knew how its earth smelt after the first shower of rain, after the long summer. Oh, how light, airy and vast its skies could be in the summer dawn. He knew the warm glow of its winter sun and the teeth-chattering cold of its winter nights. This cold-blooded murder was being carried out in broad daylight in the kuchas and gullies, where he had spent his carefree childhood, whose every turn and twist was inscribed on his heart. The boys with whom he had played gulli danda in these squares, or jumped from terrace to terrace in the desperate chases of chor police, or hung around with in Hall Bazaar as an awkward, gangly teenager, were all still here. The elders of this beloved city had all been his fathers, no matter which sort of cap or turban they wore, which god they worshipped, whether they turned towards the rising or the setting sun. To see death and bloodshed in these streets, to hear wailing on Baisakhi, broke his heart. He felt the cuts on his own body, the whiplash across his soul. And he knew, even when his anguish was raw and fresh and his body still weak from the fever, that he must do everything he could to help those who were being brutalized. He was one of the few of his generation who knew the ways of the oppressor, who had managed to walk at the edges of the world of tyrants.
Now we also introduce two British characters. There is Sergeant Nicholas Williams, bodyguard and ADC to General Dyer. And then there is Hugh J. Porter, Esquire, Chief Secretary of Punjab. You show them as conflicted, loyal servants of the empire who are also troubled by General Dyer's excesses. What was your thinking behind conceiving these two British characters?
You know, I thought this, in a way, if I did that, it would show that there were, human beings on all sides. And it's not becomes just an India story or an Indian point of view, because we've been blaming them for only saying their point of view. So we may as well look at what was happening on the other side in the minds of the other people. And ultimately, these two characters are actually inspired from scraps of real life. Hugh Porter was inspired, he was not based on, but he's inspired by J.P. Thompson, who was Chief Secretary of Punjab under Michael O'Dwyer. And in a way, he was a witness to Michael O'Dwyer. So I could use his point of view to talk about Michael O'Dwyer rather than putting it in Michael O'Dwyer's mouth itself. So now J.P. Thompson had no such qualms. He was a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist. But I wanted to make it a more conflicted character, because in fiction it's the conflicted characters which are more interesting than black and white characters. And similarly, Nicholas Williams is based on Dyer's ADC. Dyer had an ADC standing behind him when the shooting started. And that ADC was a young sergeant called William Anderson. And William Anderson then left a scrap of a memory of that day with his family. And that family then related it to a writer, Alfred Draper, who wrote the book of Amritsar, the massacre that shook the Raj. And he just left a scrap of a memory that, I turned back and I saw people in white and falling and running and screaming, etc. So I just used that and then developed Nicholas Williams, his entire life, his regiment, his training, which was not completely invented because he did belong to the London cyclists, and you could get the the background of the London cyclists and where all the regiment went, etc. So, but again, these were both British characters. Dyer on this guy was a witness on Dyer, and the other guy was a witness on O'Dwyer.
Did you choose your postings because of this book you were writing? Because you could sit in the British Library and get all this stuff. Right?
Yeah, somebody probably believed that. That's why they moved me within 9 months. So this guy's doing no work, he's sitting in the library.
And finally, we meet Udham Singh. Enigmatic, flamboyant, compelling. Why was Udham Singh important for Crimson Spring?
Udham Singh is the heart of this book. Udham Singh is the absolute character who completes the arc, the narrative arc of this book, even though he comes into his own 21 years later after the massacre. So in a way, it stretched the arc of the narrative. And it showed that, again, also the fact that, the third, we haven't talked too much about the individual, the revolutionary movement. I mean, besides the Ghadar. So, Udham Singh was the pinnacle of that movement. He treated Bhagat Singh as his guru. Bhagat Singh treated Kartar Singh Sarabha as his guru. And Udham Singh then, is such a character because he is so interesting. He is such an unreliable narrator that you wanted to put him in as much as you could, and not very easy because very few confirmed details on Udham Singh exist. But again, London being London helped. I could actually go to Pentonville prison and see the room where he was hung, where his body fell through the trap, where he lay buried for 34
till 1974.
34 years in an unmarked patch of grass the size of this stage. The prisoners who were mostly hung were all buried in layers in that. And it was not till 1974 that Government of India made the move to try and get his remains back, because as you see, he was not a very popular figure in the heyday of the freedom movement.
His assassination an act of lunacy.
He said act of insanity. Gandhi called him that, but later, his rehabilitation took some time. But I must say that when his remains were finally brought back, he got full honors. And his, if I remember right, the coffin containing the remains was carried by a delegation from Government of Punjab. It was received by Shankar Dayal Sharma at the airport. Mrs. Indira Gandhi went and placed a wreath. I think it was put in honor at Faridkot House. And then it was taken through major towns of Punjab and Haryana, and in procession until it was finally cremated in his hometown. So
do you think his assassination of Michael O'Dwyer, the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, brought some kind of a closure to the horrors of Jallianwala Bagh?
Well, for him, yes, because he was a tormented soul chasing this person.
And Dyer had already died 8 years
And
after.
Dyer had already died of natural causes in 1927. So for him it was closure. He said, I have done what I had to, and this is all recorded. After he shot, he just stood there, and they came and the sergeants came and caught him, and he said, do you speak English? He said, I speak English, but it doesn't matter because it's all done. It's over. I've done what I had to do. And but in terms of closure for the horrors, I'm not sure, because you still every year around 13th April you will see articles about when is the British government going to apologize, the centenary again brought up that. So I don't think.
And we have the acting High Commissioner of Britain right here.
That's fine. She's most welcome. But
now even General Dyer, he was seen as a butcher and a cold-blooded murderer in the eyes of Indians. But he had many admirers in Britain, as you write when you write the chapter about his funeral.
Yeah.
So has that attitude changed 75 years after the end of empire?
Well, firstly, at that time, the reaction in Britain was not monolithic. I mean, there were people, particularly on the liberal side, the politicians, etc., who thought Dyer had gone a bit too far. And that was shown in the debate in the House of Commons. And then Dyer was not given, he was just retired and asked to go off. But the House of Lords, which was far more conservative, sort of protected him. I think today it would be difficult for any sensible person in any country, but in Britain, to ever think that Dyer did the right thing. I mean, that entire period is over, and that time is gone. And you have the whole movement for reparations. You have questions coming up whether you want objects of art should be returned. So I think it's a different world we live in. But even then, there was not a monolithic reaction, because Jallianwala Bagh shocked people even in Britain. But there were people who collected 26,000 pounds.
I know, for General Dyer,
Yeah.
absolutely. Which would be what, 2.6 million pounds in today's...
Some incredible sum.
Yeah.
10 pounds from Rudyard Kipling went into that fund.
Not surprising. Now, attitude towards our own revolutionary heroes of the freedom movement took a long time to change. I mean, as you said, we got the remains of Udham Singh back only in 1974. Do you think in our veneration of Mahatma Gandhi and his non-violent movement for India's freedom, we gave short shrift to the revolutionaries who were not afraid to use violence to achieve freedom?
I think to a large extent you're right, because I think India's freedom movement became world famous as a non-violent movement, and ultimately that's what succeeded, at least that was the wave that succeeded. But there were a lot of people who gave up, sacrificed themselves. They may be called sirfiras and crazies, but they were actually 18, 19, 20 years old, who could have just carried on with their lives. So I think we have been a bit unfair to the revolutionaries, and in talking about them or exploring their lives. As I say, we don't have to celebrate violence, but we have to celebrate sacrifice. And there were people who came. I mean, Kartar Singh Saraba was an 18-year-old student in Berkeley. He could have carried on there, but he came back here and went to the gallows. He didn't need to. So there were a lot of people who actually believed and who did sacrifice. It made the ultimate sacrifice. So I think somewhere their stories need to be told a bit more.
Now let us turn our focus from the interior life of your characters.
You want to leave? We have time?
Yeah, I think we have time.
Okay.
Focus from the interior life of the characters to the larger social and religious currents at play in early 20th century Punjab. You write about the money lending business. You write about the development of irrigation through the canal systems. You write about the movement to wrest control of the gurdwaras from the corrupt mahants. And this is a book also as much about geography as it is about history. So how did all these currents shape the identity of modern Punjab?
Well, that's the whole thing of Punjabiyat that you are going to. It's a large concept. We must remember that for 50 years, the large Punjab was the kingdom of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and that gave it an identity which was multi-religious, it was secular, because in Ranjit Singh's court there were Sikhs, yes, but there were equal number of Muslims and Pandits and very powerful people. So that entire thing gave a united Punjab, plus of course the whole culture, the language, the music, the poetry of Bulle Shah, Waris Shah, which was shared across religions. The language of the Gurmukhi Punjab gave, it became a kind of a spiritual script, because the Gurus wrote in Gurmukhi, the Sufis, the Bhaktas, You know, so all this was the culture, social geography, and it was dominated by geography because of the rivers, because, so when you had the canals, you know, all this expanded. There were vast areas, you know, the bars, the Sandal bar, which the canals then, you know, made green. So this entire thing spread. So all this was there together, and then there was the partition. So the partition, in a sense, divided more than just land. You know, it divided people with a shared language, with a shared history. You know, so which is why you see this angst in Punjab all the time about partition. So I think all these things were deeply related. I'm not sure I answered your specific question.
No, but I think because you referenced Punjabi, let me end with this particular question. I was particularly struck by your description of Hindu-Muslim amity in the anti-Rowlatt Act agitations. As you write on page 31, I think. Nor had he seen a Ram Navami festival like the one on the 9th. Muslims had joined Hindus in the celebration and walked through the narrow bazaars arm in arm. Young Muslim boys formed cordons to enable Hindu girls to pass safely through the crowd. At various places on that hot day, and particularly at the Chowk, where the Munariwala Bazaar meets the Ghantaghar Bazaar, they stopped to make a big show of communal amity. Hindu boys wearing Muslim takiyas, and Muslims proudly wearing saffron tikas on their foreheads, drank water from shared earthen cups. Together they shouted the slogans, Ram Chandra Ji ki Jai, Mahatma Gandhi ki Jai, Hindu Musalman ki Jai. And yet, just 20 years later, they were at each other's throat when the partition riots happened. So, did Punjabi trump religion for a time being? And how did it all change?
I think for a time being, yes. Punjabiyat was the dominant thought, but the time that you're talking about, particularly, I mean, the communities were coming together to fight colonial rule. And there was nothing more irritating for Sir Michael O'Dwyer than Hindu-Muslim amity, because, you know, then he could not divide the two communities. But then again, I think every time that religion came up, Punjabi had suffered. You know, when religion came up, when firstly the religious boundaries at the end of the 19th century became, you know, everybody started saying, no, we are so and so, we are so and so, this is the right way to live, this is the right way. So that it became a conflict. And then, of course, the entire Unionist Party syndrome and the partition was the ultimate blow to Punjabiyat. When you know, religious fervor reached such a height that everything else didn't matter. So, you know, in good times, Punjabiyat works.
On that good note, I think let's open it up to some questions from the audience. But ladies and gentlemen, Navtej Sarna is Crimson Spring. Sanjay, Secretary West.
I don't have a mic. A couple of observations. One is, I didn't get a sense that Michael O'Dwyer has been examined as a character. Was that deliberate? I mean, one would presume that you probably you look at him closely. Number two, how would this book be received on either sides of India, left and right, or neighborhood? Because it goes back to a period when it was undivided India. Could you anticipate the reactions, or for that matter, even let's say down in Kerala or you know, further removed? Because this was an event. It was a time when the freedom movement complexion was changing, Gandhiji's thoughts, etc. So as Tyrion Lannister says, you always need a good story to get people excited. And for an ordinary Indian, I don't think colonialism probably met as a heavy burden if it wasn't for an incident like this, because then it triggers reactions. So these are just some observations.
That is an interrogation.
No, it is an observation, not a question. No, I think Michael O'Dwyer is not fully is examined because, you know, nor is Dyer for that matter, except through the eyes of you know, the people who knew them closely. So to that extent he is. But, ultimately I had, if I had done it, David would have thrown it out, So it might have become too much. How the book would be received, I honestly don't know. On the left and right side of this country, what do you mean, in Pakistan or I see no reason why it should, if they were to read it, it's a common history. I see, particularly in Pakistan, if this book was to read, it's a common Punjab. There's this book is all about, there's Lahore and there's Chenab and there is Jhelum and there is, across the border. So, as in terms of other parts of India, well, if these stories are not well known because there was a physical distance from a certain event, then I think they deserve to be known better, because I think these are stories which are not provincial. They are for the whole country.
Mr. Sarna, recently one of this side, former Prime Minister of Britain submitted apology for the Jallianwala Bagh. Do you think this Jallianwala incident, General Dyer, can be prosecuted like a Newburgh court? And Justice Root made a statement that British people looted $30 trillion, and there is some case of prosecution for that.
No, I think you're mixing up too many things. Yes, please. Yes, boss.
I was just wondering whether you had come across other stories, literary attempts to portray Jallianwala Bagh. Like a story like Usne Kaha Tha portrays the World War I and the Punjab experience. Was there any precedent in literary handling of the Jallianwala Bagh? Because it's a too huge and difficult subject, I suppose.
Honestly, I didn't. I didn't, and it doesn't mean that it's not been written, but I didn't see a story which brought in Jallianwala Bagh as well as these other historical trends. Yeah. Yes, please.
Navtej, it's a very exciting genre which. This is a very exciting genre which you are dealing with, and if you remember Freedom at Midnight, because that was the first of its kind. Now, you said you had set limits for yourself when you were writing the book, in terms of being close to history as much as possible. But purely as a writer, I just want to understand that from you. Where would you put an end to exaggeration? Because this is such an emotive and an evocative subject. Where do you think would be the point where you say, no, I have to step back and just share that experience with us as a writer?
No, I think, Jaggi, you're a writer yourself, so you know the problems in the craft. But I think it really becomes that whatever is known in terms of fact and established fact, you can't change. Or you shouldn't change. I wouldn't change. And then you find the gaps. And then you take the trends. For instance, Udham Singh here. He speaks a lot in this book. But it's not that I made it all up. There were hints in his letters. He wrote a lot of letters in prison. So there are hints in his letters, and you can take those hints and push it in the same direction. But you can't take his thoughts and turn him into that if he's a historical character. But if I have fictional characters like I have Maya, I have Rala, I have Mehtab Singh, I can do whatever I want with them. So that's where you find your balance in this game.
Manish, in your literary reimagining, in your literary reimagining of this historic event, blood-soaked historic event, when you were writing this book, what is the revelation here? As this is much written about episode in the history, but what did you discover? What was your private discovery about this particular event, which you would like the world to know more about? or which is being brought out by the book? Thank you.
I think one of the things is that you get real about the event. It was a terrible event, but it was not that 20,000 people looked at it. I mean, you see the latest movie, Sardar Udham. That movie shows so many women as victims. You know,
The Bollywood version of it.
that's the Bollywood one. So my discovery was actually that yes, there were a total crowd was about 20,000 to 25,000, and the number of killed would be anything from 400 or 379, which is the officially accepted figure, to about 1,000. So that, one thing was to bring it to scale. Horrific, yes, but we must not say that so many women were killed, etc. That was one big revelation. And the second was that really the victims were actually spread across all the three major religions. So we can't say that all of them were of one particular religion. So the mix of people was very interesting, because in common perception it's not, these are a couple of things, but it's just off the cuff.
Navtej, you mentioned a very touching statement. Now, this was that you celebrate, you don't celebrate violence, but you celebrate their sacrifice. Now, I'm reminded of two young students from St. Stephen's College who were hanged in 1915, Awad Bihari and Amirchand, who still the college refuses to recognize. So I agree with the fact that we don't give the sacrifice the due importance we should have.
You recognize the last part?
We don't give them importance, what is due to them in history.
Yeah, I don't think that's a statement, so I can agree with you. I think there were some hands there. Yes, Jillian.
Yeah, I have a mic also. आपके बातों से लगता है कि आपके बहुत साल लग गए हैं इस काम में. आपने कभी सोचा कि यह हमारे बस की बात नहीं है, ये समंदर को कूजे में बंद करने की कोशिश है. और दूसरी बात ये कि आपके सारे रिसर्च में आपने कभी एक अंग्रेज ऑफिसर का नाम सुना है जिसका नाम मैसी था, जो मौजूद थे अमृतसर में, और अमृतसर और जालियनवाला बाग के बाद मुसलमान बन के चले गए और नाम भी बदल गए और मसीह बन गए.
मैंने ये सब सोचा कि इसको छोड़ दूं, ये बेकार का काम है, ये कभी किताब नहीं बनेगी. और मासी साहब के बारे में भी पढ़ा था, और एक बार ये भी सोचा था कि मासी को एक प्रोटैगनिस्ट बनाऊंगा इस किताब में, लेकिन फिर वो आइडिया कहीं छूट गया. और मासी बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग आदमी था, वो आर्मी ऑफिसर था अमृतसर में, and he was so disgusted after the event that he stayed on in India as a Muslim. He was a very interesting character. But ये सब सोचा Jillian. Yes, Preeti.
I was intrigued by the title of the book. Fantastic. Sometimes if you just look at Crimson Spring, it can be interpreted in a very positive manner until you go to the upper half and you realize it's vultures and blood. So your thought process while giving this cover page.
There are several layers to this. The thought process is the morning cup of tea with my wife. And that's where it happened. And then we were throwing things around, and then she came up with Crimson Spring. I said, Crimson Spring. I texted it to David. He immediately responded. Perfect. So that was that. And then the rest of it was Bena Sareen, sitting at the back somewhere, who came up with this brilliant vision. And then the illustrator who actually painted it. So, it goes through all this. Yes?
Yeah. So as a young Punjabi Sikh lad, I want to understand what's the difference in the Punjabiyat of that era when you've written the book in, and the Punjabiyat which we actually are living in right now?
Very good question, Prateek. But you know, I did not live through that era, but I wanted to capture in things which I had heard from my grandmother's grandfather, or my father, and you know, his childhood memories. So a lot of that I wanted to capture in, so that people like you, even 2 places removed, could relate to it. If you know, the kind of food, the kind of language, the kind. Of course, this is written in English, but you lose a lot in that. But that was one thing. How is Punjabi different today? Today, where is Punjabi? Today, your Punjabiyat is largely abroad. You know, it's largely abroad because you go to London or you go to Toronto. You stop thinking you are an Indian or a Pakistani or which part of Punjab. You suddenly, they're all dancing to the same music, going to the same restaurants. The language becomes a great thing. So a lot of the Punjabiyat is today being celebrated. Then a lot of the Punjabiyat has come down to music. You know, you've seen this. I never knew what a phenomenon Mr. Moosewala was, but you know, he was huge. And then you have films, and you know, the manifestation of Punjabiyat has become this. The manifestation of Punjabiyat as a feeling or as a nebulous, kind of glue which brings society together irrespective of religion. I don't think you're seeing much of that.
And Navtej, if I may.
Yes.
So
this is the real question.
Okay, I'll keep that for the second one. No, I must confess, I'm only halfway through this wonderful book. And I thought in some places I heard voices of your father's writing, particularly some of the short stories from Savage Harvest. Did those somewhere creep into your consciousness when you were writing this book? And the trick question is, on Jallianwala Bagh, when I was doing some work on it, I thought that the whole story about the well in which hundreds of people jumped was a hyped up story, did not stand the test of fact and history. Did you also come across something like that?
I think absolutely right on both counts. You would find some sort of reflections of what my father has written in terms of, because I've learned whatever I've learned of that Punjab from him. So I'm sure some things have come which I cannot place a finger on what it is, but if as a reader and as somebody who knows his writing, you have found it, then I think you must be right. On the well, yes. The well is a very mysterious well, in the sense that we actually don't know how many people died there, how many jumped there. There are some theories that a lot of people jumped there and that there were bodies rotting there even weeks after the event. And there is some you will find somewhere that Motilal Nehru visits, and it is ascribed to him that he saw bodies there. Then somebody denies it. So I was very sparing in my references to the well. I did say that people jumped in there, and some of them drowned. I'm not sure, frankly, whether a lot of it gets exaggerated in popular things. So I don't think too many people probably did not jump into that well. Yes, you're absolutely right on both counts. Yes, please. I can Vasundhara? Last question. Last question.
Can I ask? Good evening, Mr. Sarna.
We take two. Last two.
Good evening, Mr. Sarna. I was wondering, during your research, did you come across any material on Frida Bedi and BPL Bedi, who also had a major contribution towards Punjab politics and independence struggle?
No, I did not, because I may be wrong, but I think Frida Bedi was later. Possibly. I may be wrong, but I did not, neither did I look for it, nor did I come across.
Okay, because the Britishers, there have been 3 British writers who've written about their contribution. Because their struggle, their whole party work started in Oxford. And then they came to Punjab and then so I'm trying to research on that. So I was just wondering in case you came across. Anyway, thank you so much.
You must write to Ram Guha.
Ram.
Because he's written a recent book on, rebels against the Raj of foreigners who lived in India and fought for India's freedom. Yes, please. Last question. One more.
Wide-ranging analysis are in the Mediterranean of your mind. Do you think Jallianwala Bagh massacre was the greatest insult heaped on the head of humanity in the freedom movement, in the annals of freedom movement?
Well, I think in India it was a seminal event, if I can call it that, the worst expression of colonial depredation in India. But you just have to do massacre and Wikipedia, and you will get a list which is pages long of massacres from 1000 AD to now. And the number of victims ranges from 3, 5 to 3,000. So, but yes, in India's colonial history, 200 years, yes, it was the worst. Yes.
Secondly, you can reply to one-liner.
Sorry?
Just another one-liner. If you want to reply, the independence of India, whom it was given. Two names come off and on, Mahatma Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose. So, in your own reckoning,
I think the independence of India was given to Indians.
So in the desire to write this book, or the research or the actual writing, were you motivated by anti-colonial angst? Did it increase your angst? Did it feel personal, or was it all cold research, historical research, you're just writing about an event, writing a novel? I ask this especially in the context of closure that you were discussing, both of you, and you mentioned that there are demands from time to time for the British to apologize, but I hardly hear any demands. Recently, when Boris Johnson came to India, who demanded the British to apologize? Nobody.
No, I think time is time, So that happens, and some amount of emotion comes in when you're writing a book, which is this thing. But again, I think as a writer, you have to stop ranting, and you can't be motivated by angst alone. I mean, yes, you may feel that I need to write this wrong in some form, and you do that. But I think ultimately a cool head helps your writing much more. I must thank Vikas. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I guess you'll agree with me. The conversation today, I hope, has given you enough reasons to step out and buy the book. And thank you, Mr. Vikas Swarup and Mr. Navtej Sarna, for such an enthralling discussion. And thank you to such a wonderful audience. The copies of the book are available outside, and Mr. Sarna will be very happy to sign them for you. Thank you so much.